I'm just going to read it. John's presentation results in part from a more than a year of his meeting with me at Harvard Archives and at our home, where there is a conglomerate of materials he has found. His patient reading, his scanning, his filming, his going through everything at home has meant a pouring over of related materials and sermons that we would not normally have poured over. So there are huge thanks for that. Tyler's complete long 11-year list of Boston ASC sermons and scattered 11-year materials have come up during this period because of John. That brings us to Victor's files. We have virtually no file materials from South Africa. I suspect that is because they either have turned them into police when we left, or the police have confiscated them. That's something that we'll have to look into now that we realize that no one else has any sermon from his 6 years there. I have one that a parishioner sent to me, but that's it. The file from our first South African return in 1985 was his first solo trip, and then one with me, and then he returned from 1965 to 1966 for 6 months of meetings with all of the people concerned in the anti-apartheid movement there. Then in his 1990s, we returned together, once during the initial government transition, when the governments were combining with one another, and then once at Mandela's presidential beginning. We took daily notes of this. Vic's notes are non-existent. I don't know where they are. We've gone through all of his materials. Fortunately, my notes are all there. They're there from daily notes that he has read and liked or affirmed, whatever. By grace, Perkins School during the 2000s asked me to go to where? South Africa. So I went there 1 to 2 times a year for a month, usually at a time, or 2 weeks, depending on the work. Working with 4 different school programs for children with visual and multiple disabilities. This also was made possible for Victor because they paid me, and that meant we could afford for him to go with me. Throughout his trajectory of churches, I became less involved because of our children, so that he was very involved with the children, but he was also very involved with the church. Maybe a little less with the children, and I was a little more with the children. We worked it out together, and that seems to have been okay with the children. He shared as much as possible in our home and our family life as the urban needs would allow us. There was Tyler. He had to grow up in those urban needs as a preacher's kid, as they call it. His first grandchild, a 6-month-old Louise Carpenter, is the recipient of a grandfather who, despite workload, will babysit 1 day a week. I don't know anybody who does that, to care for his granddaughter. He also aids his sister in disabilities, not to mention housing and aid for the aged mother, Kathy. We thank Tyler for monitoring my South African gifts to the needy, which continue, for the Unitarian Church there, and for the School for Autistic Children Vic and I helped to start in December 1966 as we are during our band departure. My life after entering and leaving Belmont continues to center on disability advocacy, but also surprises with renewed things that John has brought into the house and a renewed sense of life of Victor's life and work. So for that, I thank you personally, John, but also for the church for having the interest. Victor loved this church. He loved his ministry, and as emeritus or as full-time minister here in Belmont, he couldn't have been more satisfied by a closing time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kathy, very much. Well, let me then, that was wonderful. I'll pick up and I'll carry right on. And I actually, Kathy, want to begin by mentioning a memory that you recently recalled for me of a spring day in 1962 at the Carpenter home in Norwell. While Kathy was playing the piano in the family living room, a phone call came in for Victor in his office. It was from the director of ministry at the UUA headquarters in Boston. And after a brief, indistinct conversation, a few minutes later, Victor called out to Kathy from the next room. "Dear, do you want to go to South Africa for 5 years?" Without much of any hesitation, Kathy responded, "Why not? Sure." In that moment, a choice was made that would shape not just the rest of their lives, your lives, Kathy, but the lives of thousands who would come into the Carpenter's orbit, including many of us, I think all of us gathered here tonight, as Victor would emerge as one of the most influential UU ministers of the past half century. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I want to retrace what brought Victor to that moment, to describe Victor and Kathy's experiences in South Africa, and then to describe how this choice would shape all that followed in their lives. I'm going to be displaying materials that Kathy has generously shared with me from their personal collection that are now destined for the archives at the Harvard Divinity School for the benefit of future scholars and historians. So I hope everybody can see this slide. Victor's beginnings were on Wednesday, October 23rd, 1929. This was the very day that the first cracks appeared in the United States stock market and led to the following Black Monday. Victor's father was a successful dentist with patients who came to Boston from across the nation to see him. The family rode out the Depression with no major impact. And in Victor's own words, he led a cocooned, comfortable bourgeois existence on upscale Bay State Road, right near Boston University. The family had no religious affiliation apart from a brief fling with Christian Science. He was an indifferent student who loved to go to the movies, often entering the cinema with a box of a dozen jelly donuts. We actually don't have any pictures of Victor as a teenager, but I'm sure we would be shocked if we did, because by his late teens, he was massively obese at about 300 pounds. In 10th grade, his parents sent him to Deerfield Academy. It was a very prestigious school for socially elite students, for which Victor developed no fondness, a feeling he describes as mutual. He returned home in 1948 and he entered BU with no real sense of life direction. Then one day in 1951, Victor walked by a Marine Corps recruiting station in Boston. He got this idea in his head and he enlisted the following day, to the shock and surprise of his family. He later described this as the first independent choice I ever made. The very next day, he was on a train to Parris Island, South Carolina, and within a few months, he shipped off to Korea for 2 years. His MOS, or military occupational specialty, was operating amphibious troop conveyors. This was his first exposure to colleagues who did not share his privileged background, and it was a profound social learning experience. He also learned a great deal about himself, specifically, in his own words, that he could challenge and direct others. He returned to Boston after the armistice at a lean 150 pounds, literally half the body weight at which he had first enlisted. Now, Victor earned his bachelor's degree from BU with an English major in 1955. And at this time, his brother John was serving as a crucifer at the Second Church of Boston, which was once Emerson's church, and that would soon merge with the First Church of Boston. Its magnificent building on Audubon Circle now serves as the home for the Ruggles Baptist Church. John invited Victor to come and check it out. Victor was frankly a bit bored by the high church liturgy, but he came under the influence of the minister, Clayton Brooks Hale. And one Sunday, Victor found a note in the pews that the church was seeking a Sunday school teacher, actually a few. He learned the ropes of Unitarianism, and Hale recognized Victor's latent talent for a career in ministry. Hale arranged for Victor to go to North Fryburg, Maine, to serve as the summer minister at a Universalist chapel in 1956. This was a remote agrarian village about 100 miles north of Boston. The population was lily white. Few of the locals attended college. Many never finished high school. It was a very different type of community for Victor, this privileged city boy. He absolutely loved it, and they loved him. He ended up continuing for a year, commuting from Boston to Maine on the weekends. And he formed a close and lasting bond with the North Fryburg community. They even had a reunion just 10 or 15 years ago. One indelible event in his life was bringing a group of the chapel's youths several hours by car to Boston to hear Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, address a meeting in Roxbury. After driving for hours, he and the group were turned away at the door due to the color of their skin. It was a searing experience that helped to form Victor's acute sense of racial injustice in the world. His next step was to enter Harvard Divinity School in the fall of 1956. The school's faculty at that time was entirely white, entirely male, and the first 3 women divinity students had only just been admitted. Among the great scholars on the faculty at that time were the likes of Paul Tillich and Richard Niebuhr. James Luther Adams had joined the faculty in 1956, and the historian Conrad Wright was a lead administrator of the divinity program. The curriculum was steeped in European theology, and Victor found the academic atmosphere somewhat stifling. He was not much interested in the historical critical debates about biblical interpretation, and was frankly much more interested in, as he described it, and as W.E. Du Bois described it, the color line, the pressing social problems of the current day in the late 50s, the color line running through American society. And one major influence on his life at this time was his roommate, Guy Hansen, who you see there on the right. Geddes Hansen was a Jamaican of African heritage who would go on to become a prominent Presbyterian minister and the first Black professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. Guy and Victor, as roommates, had frequent, intense, and occasionally painful exchanges, but they became close friends. One of Victor's most bitter experiences from this era of his life was when his parents would not welcome Guy to join them at home for Thanksgiving dinner, and that was a source of lasting damage in the Carpenter family. Now, apart from those 3 women I mentioned who were enrolled in the divinity program, there was another young woman at Harvard Divinity School who caught Victor's eye. Catherine Larrabee was a recent Skidmore College graduate from West Hartford, Connecticut. She had just moved to Boston and joined the Harvard Divinity School staff as an administrative assistant for the BD program and the Divinity School faculty board, primarily supporting Conrad Wright. Victor sought out an introduction to Kathy. They met, they had a whirlwind courtship, and quite unexpectedly, Victor proposed within 6 months. They were married at the West Hartford Unitarian Church in December 1957. And then at that point, Victor's first brief period of full-time ministry was at Christ Church on Dix Street in Dorchester, where he was ordained in the fall of 1958. This is a small parish, was a small parish in Fields Corner. They lived in a triple-decker that was owned by a local rabbi. This was a transitional neighborhood in the late 50s, experiencing the flight of white Protestants and Catholics to the suburbs and an influx of European Jewish refugees as they, and Victor and Kathy often heard Yiddish spoken on the streets. Because the Unitarian population was small and declining, Victor's salary at this time was actually covered by the benevolent fraternity, the Ben Frat, or today's UU Urban Ministry. Victor urged Unitarian headquarters that the church should really be converted into a community service center attached to the larger First Church of Dorchester up on the hill, but they didn't agree. So Victor correctly realized that Christ Church had no long-term future in Dorchester and that he and Kathy really couldn't stay. So within a year, he accepted a call to the first parish of Norwell. Victor was a young, dynamic minister. He was becoming an excellent preacher, and unsurprisingly, other churches started trying to recruit him. But Victor had no interest in simply moving from one all-white suburban church to another. The Carpenters, frankly, found that this fast-growing South Shore suburb had a rather bland Stepford wife feel that Victor later likened to John Updike's novel, Couples. Both Victor and Kathy felt uncertain about their future. At one point, Victor spotted a notice that the Unitarian Church in Cape Town, South Africa, was seeking a new minister, but the position was soon filled. Now, Victor's most lasting legacy from this period of his life was his launch of the South Shore Community Forum. This speaker series, which has evolved but still functions today, brought major figures to Norwell, including his HDS professor, Paul Tillich. This very first brochure from 1961 includes Victor's bold statement that the church shares a responsibility to stimulate personal concern in the areas of social action. That was a view not widely shared in many churches at the time, but it became the central theme that would dominate his entire career in ministry. The recruiting calls continued, and at one point in early 1962, Victor met with the director of ministry at the UUA and asked him, "Please stop the calls. I don't want to go anywhere if it's not South Africa, and that job has already been taken." Well, it was literally just a month or so later that the phone rang with the news that the ministry the minister selected for Cape Town was unable to take the assignment. The Carpenters made the bold leap, and just 3 months later, they were on a ship to Cape Town with their 3-year-old son, Tyler, and the large rocking horse that he had received for Christmas. This evidently was Tyler's one condition for agreeing to the family's new assignment. Now, we could fill hours with stories of Victor's and Kathy's 5 years in Cape Town. Sadly, as Kathy mentioned, we don't have a documentary archive of Victor's own correspondence and sermons, but we do have a lot of other material. I'm going to try to hit the highlights of this era concisely and first talk a bit about the history. The early 60s was an era of intense racial strife in the US and South Africa alike, but events would soon take South Africa in a sharply different direction. This was the height of the post-war decolonization era. South Africa had originally been a Dutch colony from the 1650s. It was later contested by the French under Napoleon, and ultimately in the late 1800s, the British set their sights on controlling the region to protect the valuable trade route to India. Actually, early 1800s in the Napoleonic era. And then by the turn of the 20th century, the British were more focused on exploiting the vast mineral wealth of South Africa. Conflict between the new British colonists and the longtime white Afrikaners of Dutch heritage led to the Boer Wars and a very costly victory for the British. South Africa became a self-governing dominion of the British Empire in 1910 and a fully independent sovereign state within the British Commonwealth in 1934. And then it became a republic beyond British monarchical rule by public referendum in 1961. Throughout the 20th century, though, local politics were really dominated by white Afrikaner nationalism. The system of racial apartheid was first introduced in South Africa in 1948. Victor and Kathy arrived in 62, and that was actually the same year when African National Congress leader Nelson Mandela was arrested. Mandela would soon be imprisoned on Robben Island and stay there almost continuously until 1990. Okay, so these are images of the Howe Street Church, officially known as the Free Protestant Unitarian Church of South Africa, in the city of Cape Town. It's a church that had been founded in the 1860s by an Afrikaner who first went to Holland to study for the ministry in the Calvinist tradition. While he was there, he was exposed to a volume by the great Unitarian transcendentalist Theodore Parker, and he returned to open a church in the liberal tradition. By Victor's time, it featured a British worship style. It was a bit run down with a pale stone facade that would later be painted this vibrant blue. And I think, Kathy, we see that blue facade image behind you on your screen. Victor and Kathy arrived knowing little of the nation's dark and complex history, but they became fast learners, guided by many good friends, both within and outside the church. One of them told Victor, as Victor himself would later write, "At some state, you cross a boundary. You begin to understand what it's like to be Black, to be the underdog, to have no rights, always to be a victim of a ruthless and implacable oppressor. And once you cross that line, things are different." Within a year in South Africa, he concluded, Kathy and I both crossed that line. Now, if they arrived with the naive expectation of finding an African version of the hopeful American civil rights struggle, they soon found a very different and depressing reality as the grip of the apartheid system became steadily tighter. But they were now committed. Victor did not waver in his insistence on addressing the crisis of apartheid openly and forthrightly, both from his pulpit and in the local media and other public appearances. In his early days, an American consular officer approached Victor with a rewarding offer if he would become a CIA informant. Victor immediately and resolutely turned down the offer. But from that moment on, he generally steered clear of the US expat community. Victor wrote that at the Cape Town Church, he quickly came to recognize the same traits he had seen in his white liberal parishioners in the United States, what he described as a self-protective instinct to separate theology from basic social reality. He wrote that it was actually Kathy who first felt that the situation demanded more of them. Still in her late 20s, Kathy became the very first American woman to join the Black Sash. This organization was a nonviolent resistance movement, primarily of white women of British heritage, who worked to help Black South African residents fight for their rights and peacefully protested the government's repressive apartheid policies. Victor initially found that his own status as a minister and as an American allowed him to travel fairly freely. He regularly drove to Durban and Johannesburg to visit two small fellowships in his charge. Over time, he began to carry both messages and money between members of the underground resistance. Gradually, he became deeply involved in their struggle. By 1964, he was involved in the International Defense and Aid Fund, or IDAF, which was formed to assist and provide legal funding for persons accused of political crimes. Although the Cape Town Unitarian community was tiny relative to other denominations, Victor earned a place as a prominent participant in interfaith dialogues. He frequently spoke at public meetings and was quoted in the newspapers. Now, in 1964 and 65, you'll remember that the United States Congress passed and President Johnson signed the landmark Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. Meanwhile, South Africa was becoming an even more isolated outlier subject to an arms embargo by the UN in 1963. In June of '66 came one of the most electrifying events of the entire decade. Senator Robert F. Kennedy traveled to South Africa and gave several public addresses at universities, including an historic speech remembered as the Ripple of Hope speech at a Cape Town meeting of NUSAS, the National Union of South African Students. The Kennedys also visited a few all-Black townships. This visit generated new hope for South Africa's future. Victor and Kathy attended this speech, and they met the young blonde-haired woman you see seated behind Kennedy in the picture in the lower left. Margaret Marshall, the vice president of NUSAS, welcomed Kennedy in place of the organization's president, who had recently been banned by order of the government. Margaret and the Carpenters would become lifelong friends, and several of you may recall her visit to the church, First Church in Belmont, pictured at the right, to join the celebration of Victor's retirement during her time as Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. Now, despite Kennedy's visit, the political climate continued to darken. In March of '66, the IDAF, on whose board Victor was now serving, was banned by the government as an alleged communist front. Victor was not straight away arrested, but he was required to report to the police weekly and warned that he could be forced to leave the country without notice at any time. The violence was intensifying. The nation's prime minister, Hendrik Verwoerd, was assassinated in September 1966, violently stabbed to death inside the National Assembly building. Verwoerd, the primary architect of apartheid, was succeeded by Johannes Forster, the head of secret police and the primary enforcer of the apartheid system. By 1967, the slide into full-blown fascism was now pretty much complete. Now, against this entire backdrop, Kathy and Victor continued to raise a growing family with unique needs and challenges. Following Tyler, Kathy gave birth to two girls in South Africa, both with severe disabilities. Gracia was born in 1963 with multiple sensory deficits, labeled as autism. Melissa was born in 1964, severely deaf as a result of a worldwide rubella epidemic that was then prevalent. The girls' needs for treatment and support quickly became acute. Victor's continued participation in high-profile advocacy and underground resistance posed risks to the family that were becoming untenable. So finally, in November of 1967, the family was forced to leave South Africa hastily and very possibly just ahead of Victor's arrest, certainly with no hope of obtaining visas for a return. So a new chapter in the Carpenters' lives now began with a call for Victor to lead the first Unitarian church in Philadelphia. This would be the first of three prominent urban ministries, also including churches in Boston and San Francisco. He began there on January 1st, just weeks after the family's hasty departure from Africa. 1968 would be a landmark year of incredible turmoil for the United States. We endured the assassinations of both Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, the peak of the Vietnam War, violence at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and the election of Richard Nixon. Victor's new church had been in decline due to white flight, and its building was run down. But a pioneer urban gentrification movement was just getting underway, and Victor and Kathy made the pivotal decision to live in the center city, Philadelphia. The Black empowerment controversy within the UUA was at its height, and Victor would become one of the champions of efforts to provide meaningful funding to Black-led organizations. But a backlash developed, and he would later write a candid and unsparing book about failed efforts within the UU movement in this period to build bridges across the racial divide. Now, Victor began to take on a widening range of social justice issues during the Philadelphia years. Abortion was still illegal in Pennsylvania and most other states in the late 60s. And along with his close colleague, Beth Ide, who you see pictured on the right there, he got engaged in the clergy consultation service on abortion, which was a service to help women procure abortions in safe jurisdictions in the US or outside of the country. He performed the first lesbian union in 1968, years before same-sex unions were celebrated in any other church, and celebrated a first union between two gay men in the congregation a year later. He frequently spoke out against the Vietnam War and police brutality. This earned Victor a prominent spot on the enemies list of Mayor and former police commissioner Frank Rizzo. Victor publicly spoke about he had known plenty of characters like Rizzo during his years in apartheid Cape Town. The two men had several encounters during these years. In Victor's words, never pleasant nor productive. Now, these were also some of the most challenging years that Victor and Kathy would spend as parents of three growing children. Kathy found work with children with disabilities at Philadelphia's Children's Hospital. The family spent several summers at Star Island, where they stayed in the parsonage and led summer programs together. Here we see Victor adopting a bit of a new look with longer hair, a new beard, and a rather questionable pair of jeans, similar to ones I wore as a teenager in the same time period. Now, given Victor's demanding public role, Kathy bore the laboring oar in managing care and schooling for Gracia and Melissa. Finally, Victor helped to complete a badly needed renovation of the Philadelphia church building and sanctuary. A final sabbatical gave the Carpenters a respite and a chance to return to Victor's hometown of Boston. They actually stayed in Weston for several months. He received a call to the pulpit at Boston's Arlington Street Church with the position to start in I believe, January 1966. Kathy would now be in a better position to oversee the girls' needs and also to pursue a master's degree in deafblind education at Boston College. She would go on to a career as a teacher and advocate for families of children with disabilities. Now, Arlington Street Church is certainly one of the UU denomination's most storied congregations, the pulpit from which William Ellery Channing once preached. Its iconic sanctuary building, modeled on London's St. Martin in the Fields, was actually the very first public building in Boston's Back Bay. But by the early 1970s, like so many churches, actually, including our own. Okay. By the early 70s, like so many churches, including our own, Arlington Street had fallen on hard times. The most recent industry had ended in trauma. Wealthy members were defecting, attendance was down to about 60 or 70 per week, and the church building and the next door parish house were both in severe disrepair. The finances were so weak that the UUA was directly subsidizing the church's operations. Local real estate developers were hanging around like vultures, waiting for the church's failure. But Victor persevered through these difficulties and led the rebuilding of the church community. Attendance doubled, and within 3 years, the church became self-sustaining once again. By 1980, Boston as well was entering a period of renaissance. Now here, we're taking a look along Boylston Street. It's now a glittering boulevard, but it actually looked pretty tawdry in the 70s. I certainly remember it that way in high school and college years. Victor insisted, in the face of opposition, that the church sell off its next door parish house, which you see just to the left of the church building, in order to generate funds for a proper restoration of the landmark church building itself. Boston and the nation were engulfed in a wide range of social controversies, and Victor seems to have taken on all of them energetically. School busing to promote racial integration was leading to riots in Boston in the mid-70s. These were the early years of the gay rights movement, and by the early 80s, the emergence of the AIDS epidemic. Housing costs, let's see, we got this letter in the Globe here. Housing costs were skyrocketing. Gentrification and homelessness were becoming hot topics as Boston's fortunes revived. You'll all have access to this presentation afterwards, and you can read some of the documents. Victor was very blunt in his public pronouncements all through this time. It's really remarkable to read his words. He spoke out actively campaigning both for nuclear disarmament and against reinstatement of the military draft. Here we see Reverend Jesse Jackson coming to the Arlington Street pulpit. Victor helped to facilitate his appearance and those of many other African and African-American leaders, including Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam. Battles over immigration were heating up as civil wars in Central America drove many refugees to seek asylum in the early 1980s. The church actually provided sanctuary to a Guatemalan refugee seeking asylum in the US. And this led to what Victor suspected was a secret break-in by the Immigration and Naturalization Service that he publicly declaimed as an instance of velvet fascism. Now, certainly this picture on the left will recall the blizzard of '78, and 1978 was a year and a time period when Victor was emerging as a leader within the UU denomination. It's the first year, you can see his picture there on the program for the 1978 General Assembly, that he would appear there as a speaker. He was appointed to an independent study committee focused on the formation of RE directors and the credentialing of UU ministers of religious education. And perhaps of most relevance to Victor's life story and this talk, this was a period of rising national interest in America in the fate of South Africa, now almost entirely isolated in the world. And Victor helped to lead anti-apartheid demonstrations in Boston at this time period. With his deep in-country experience from the 1960s, Victor emerged as an expert and a national speaker on apartheid at General Assembly and at other events. But he had yet to return to the country when an invitation came for Victor and Kathy to come back to South Africa for the groundbreaking of what would become the Gracia Carpenter House at the Bera School in Cape Town. This was the school where Gracia had received care back in the 1960s as a small child. Victor initially hoped that after 16 years, the South African national government would have forgotten about him. That was not the case. And to the Carpenters' disappointment, no visas were forthcoming. But again, 2 years later, in 1985, when the building at the school was complete, Victor and Kathy were once again invited to its dedication. This time, Kathy, who was working on behalf of the IDAF in the United States, obtained the phone number of an attaché to the US Embassy to South Africa. Victor and Kathy called this man to request help in obtaining a visa to go back. Victor issued a polite and subtle threat to publicize the story in the Boston papers should they be denied the opportunity to attend the dedication of a building that was named for their daughter. Thankfully, the visas quickly came through. And so for the first time in 18 years, in 1985, the Carpenters would return to South Africa. It would be the first of 6 return visits. Now, the apartheid system was starting to break down at this point, but resistance to change was still fierce. Victor and Kathy renewed many key older relationships, and they forged several important new ones. They met, as you see here, with Helen Josephs, who was one of the truly great leaders of the anti-apartheid movement back in the 50s and 60s. This is a courageous woman who would spend 23 years of her life under house arrest. Also, they would meet with Winnie Mandela, the wife of Nelson Mandela at the time, shown here at a health clinic in the township where she lived, and the heroic Anglican Archbishop, Desmond Tutu. Oh, shoot, let me get back to where I was here. This is the danger of operating with this technology. So we will definitely cut this one out and cut this part out. Lillian. So
Yes.
Here we are. Okay, this is a scene from a mass funeral for, as you see, a whole range of caskets. I believe there were something like 20 caskets, political victims of violence who were murdered. Large-scale funerals like this were some of the only events that for which people were able to gather publicly at this time. And oh, pardon me. You know what? We're going to have to here. I'm going to have to go back to. All right, this is the show that I meant to be on. Pardon me. Okay, we'll just go forward like this. So, oh, I wanted to mention to wind up about the South Africa visit. Unbeknownst to Kathy, at that time, on their trip together, Victor had entered the country with $10,000 of cash taped to his body to provide support to the resistance movement. And then, as I think Kathy mentioned earlier, he made a second solo trip 6 months later. And again, unbeknownst to Kathy, Victor entered South Africa with $35,000 in cash. That time, the bills were stuffed into a dozen pairs of ballet slippers that he had purchased in London at Kathy's request on the way over for their daughter, Melissa, who was at the time a ballet student in Philadelphia. So the Arlington Street years culminated with a sabbatical in 1987 and another call to Victor to come to San Francisco to serve as senior minister at the First Unitarian Society, another historic urban church once served by Thomas Starr King in the 1860s. This was a large and busy congregation of roughly 600 members. Victor and Kathy agreed that she would return regularly to Boston to keep an eye on both of the girls. San Francisco was certainly an exciting city with a diverse congregation, and Victor quickly emerged as a prominent voice in the community, engaging a broad range of social justice issues and keeping the church, as this article notes, on the cutting edge in terms of social action. Just to sample some of the issues on which he was active. He served as the chair of the San Francisco Anti-War Protest Committee regarding the 1991 Gulf War that attracted something like 6,000 protesters, and later marches in support of peace in the Middle East. With San Francisco at the epicenter of the AIDS crisis, he spoke on the urgent need to address the public health emergency. He joined a fight on major church-state issues. He joined a fight on a major church-state issue seeking to force the city to divest of a prominent cross monument on a city lot that was won at the Ninth Circuit Court, but later reversed at the US Supreme Court. And as you see, the case was titled City and County of San Francisco versus Victor Carpenter et al. He was appointed chair of the mayor's task force on homelessness, and he led an effort to organize city churches to provide meals and shelter to this teeming population. He was appointed president of the UUSC, a prominent national role that would bring him back to Boston regularly for meetings, especially having to do with the raging civil war in El Salvador. He joined protests against the use of the death penalty and provided testimony in support of African refugees seeking asylum in San Francisco. And based largely on his and Kathy's experience with two disabled daughters, in 1991, Victor was invited to deliver the prestigious Berry Street essay. This was the longest running lecture series in America, founded by William Ellery Channing in 1820. And for this event, Victor chose the topic of ableism. His talk led to the formation of the first UU denominational committee on improving access for the disabled, which he would chair. But a fatal problem plagued this entire period of Victor's ministry. The associate minister was already established as a major figure at First Unitarian when Victor arrived as senior minister, and the two would have a very difficult relationship. As Victor would later describe it, Their personalities were incompatible, their styles of conducting worship were contradictory, and their vision of church values were in collision. Over time, Victor wrote, life in this grand, prestigious church in this fabulous city of San Francisco became emotionally draining and spiritually exhausting. While Victor became increasingly prominent in broader denominational affairs, matters that involved ministering to his own parishioners were vexing. He put the matter bluntly and forthrightly in his own words as follows, quote, I wrote to the church board conveying that I found the relationship with the associate minister intolerable, and for the good of the church offered them three alternatives: that she resign, that I resign, and or that we both resign, saying there was no fourth alternative. The third alternative was chosen, and both would leave to enable the San Francisco church to make a fresh start. So here they were in 1993. Victor was now nearly age 65 and Kathy nearing 60, jobless and homeless and feeling very down. Their fortunes were revived when news of Victor's call for a brief 6-month interim ministry in Rancho Palos Verdes, just outside of Los Angeles, came through. This was a healing time in a lovely seaside church for them to get back on their feet. Pacific Unitarian would have been very happy to have Victor stay, but right at this time, our own search committee was looking for a successor to Diane Miller. Chaired by Judith Hollywood, it included two key members, Hal Babcock and Dave Twitchell, who identified Victor as the lead candidate to come to Belmont. Victor's friend and colleague, John Burens, initially counseled Victor that a church like Belmont would never be interested in him. But in fact, to our great benefit, the search committee saw otherwise, and thus began one of the final and happiest chapters of this illustrious career. We once again could fill a long talk with stories of Victor's and Kathy's years with us from 1994 to 2002, but I'm actually quite mindful of the time, so I'm going to offer a brief synopsis of some of the highlights of these years. Victor's arrival occurred the month of his 65th birthday, an age when a great many people are looking to scale down. But once again, I'll use his own words. Quote, I was settled as senior minister in Belmont on my 65th birthday, working with a very compatible assistant minister, Kathy Bowers. This quintessential urban minister discovered the happiest ministry of his career in this upwardly mobile suburb. Wonders never cease. So here we actually see Victor and Kathy in a dramatic reading of A Child's Christmas in Wales that many of you may well remember, as I certainly do, from 1995. This was a practice that Victor used in going back to Philadelphia, doing dramatic readings in church, in worship services. I'd like to share just a few of the pages from the Remembrance album that we presented to Victor upon his retirement, and that is now destined to go to the Harvard archives at Kathy's direction. So here's a picture of our caring circle. Many of us experienced Victor in his late 60s, first and foremost as a committed pastor, energizing and helping many of our committees, including the caring circle. He ministered to us effectively through the tragedy of September 11th, which took away the promising life of one of our own parishioners, Ted Hennessy. These were also years of impressive growth in numbers, supported by our membership committee, pictured here. And I think, yeah, Ann Paul, there you are. And of course, the partner church relationship. Victor was a very strong supporter of our partner church in Dishvalva. Victor and Kathy traveled twice there, and they helped to host Shandor and Tunde's memorable visit with us in 1997. That visit also included a trip to General Assembly in Phoenix. Jim, I see you on the left there. And I guess Jim Staten's not on the line with us. Yes. So, but Victor and Kathy there in the center. Let's see, next we have a picture of Phil Wilson and his Rainbow Band from the Berklee College of Music, who would come. Victor was a lifelong lover of jazz, and they would come and lead us in joyful worship services in Belmont. I think about I think very happy relations that Victor had with his key staff members, including Diane Elliott. There you are at the top, our RE leader for many years. Alpha, of course, who would go on to complete something like 54 years with us. And over the years, Victor brought a number of other wonderful associate and student ministers. I found this picture of Mike Johnson in Kathy's materials, but we also had Susan Lamar and John Hickey, many other great student and associate ministers during these years. It was also, it being in the late 90s, this was an era of celebration. Victor was nearing age 70, so it was a time of retrospection. And we celebrated Victor and Kathy's 40th wedding anniversary in 1997 and 40 years of ordination in 1998. But through it all, I think Victor's passion for issues related to racial justice, racial awareness, and hopes for a better future for South Africa in particular remained among his concerns that burned the brightest. This photo shows Victor holding the chalice that he and Kathy gifted to the Howe Street Church in Cape Town to mark its 125th anniversary. Here's an interesting letter that appeared, I think many of you may remember this, in the Citizen Herald in 1995, soon after Victor's arrival. He was characteristically unafraid to call out white racism when he saw it, even right here in Belmont. He did so early in his ministry with this letter regarding a recent police incident, and it caused a stir in town. He described Belmont as a racist town, not, I believe, uniquely among American towns, but indeed characteristically as an American town. And in this framing, I think we would agree now that Victor was 20 years ahead of his time. Certainly many other social leaders would come to see and describe things the same way during the period of racial awakening we've experienced following the killings of Michael Brown, George Floyd, and other such tragedies over the past decade. Victor was a consistent, strong supporter of Belmont against racism and figured prominently in the establishment of an important Belmont tradition, the annual Martin Luther King breakfast. And for this deep commitment, he received this award, this certificate of appreciation from BAR in 2002. And speaking of awards, and I'm starting to wind up now, toward the end of his career, Victor was recognized with a number of awards that warrant mention. These include his honorary doctorate from the Starr King School for the Ministry in 1997. We have here the Harvard Divinity School Alumni Association's Katzenstein Award in 1995. And this is actually very much worth reading. So time to see how his fellow divinity alumni describe his life's work. We have the Aidan Ballou Peace Fellowship, which he received in 2003. And perhaps most significantly, the UUA's annual award for distinguished service to the cause of Unitarian Universalism, our denomination's highest award, which was given in 2011. Now, after his formal retirement from Belmont in 2002, Victor continued to serve as our minister emeritus until his death in 2018. But as he wrote elsewhere, he actually flunked retirement, and he had 3 brief interim ministries in Hingham, Carlisle, and in Dorchester. But I hope you won't mind if I take the final minute to wind up with a personal reflection on what Victor meant to me. I hope we can all take pleasure in knowing that he remembered Belmont as, quote, the happiest ministry of my career. He once amplified on this privately to me. He shared that Belmont was not his most challenging ministerial assignment, but indeed his happiest. Conversely, and with great respect for all of the dozen or so other ministers who have served in Belmont over the years, 30 years that I've been at the church, I would say that even though we were not his most challenging congregation, Victor was certainly our most challenging minister. Many Sundays after I started coming to First Church, which was in the fall of '95, I would walk home and I would ask myself, what did I most disagree with Victor about today? But over time, Victor got to me and truly changed me, and I am sure he changed the lives of thousands of others. I often hear churches tell newcomers, you're welcome here just the way you are. I believe it's essential that we be welcoming to all, however they come in the door. And yet, if we come out of church the same way we went in, then what's the point of going? Over time, I believe that Victor changed the lives of a great many of us and thousands of others far beyond Belmont and Boston for the better. I think it's very interesting that in the last year of life, Victor sought to be baptized as a Christian, not with a specific theological belief about Jesus, but with a deep sense of faith that he once articulated as follows. Faith is to believe in spite of the evidence and then to watch the evidence change. Victor's core belief was that we have it in our power, and it is therefore our duty through committed social action to change the evidence before us. And by doing so, he taught us we have the power to change for the better, both ourselves and the world. Well, thank you very much.